So, there was an interesting tidbit of news recently. Very interesting and peculiar news, in fact. And yes, I'm talking about the possibility of a And you might be thinking, psh, no way. Square Enix is remaking Final Fantasy XIII? People hated that game. And also, that's impossible. If anyone were to remake the game, it would be Creative Studio 1, which is currently hard at work on the Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3. Well, I've been thinking, and it just might be possible.
But how?
We'll get to that, but first, let's talk about how this conversation about a Final Fantasy XIII remake has spawned in the first place. If you didn't already know, Square Enix posted on X asking for people's hot takes on the Final Fantasy series, and Alex Mukala, which shout out to him, he is a music composer here on YouTube, who's obsessed with Final Fantasy, replied to their post suggesting that they need to remaster Final Fantasy XIII before they remake any other Final Fantasy games. Then things got interesting. Square Enix replied and said, any reason for a remaster instead of a remake? So that's a very odd response to a statement. Like, what are they trying to tell us? Are they just fucking with us, or are they secretly remaking this game? Why would they remake Final Fantasy XIII when it's far from being the most popular game in the series? Now, for the record, I actually liked Final Fantasy XIII, but I didn't love it. I really like the idea of the game and really wish that it lived up to its potential. Final Fantasy XIII has so much ambition, and yet the game only really just scratched the surface of its potential. Yeah, the linear hallway-like design was a little underwhelming to say the least. The story, in my opinion, was convoluted only because so much of it was hidden away inside data logs. And yes, it was a travesty that the games didn't really have any towns, or at least not in the traditional sense. I actually didn't mind the characters and was relatively engaged with the story up until Pulse. I was hoping it was going to continue expanding upon what they started, but then the story basically just stopped. On the flip side, the game started to open up at that point, which a lot of people really enjoyed. I also didn't mind it, except the world is completely empty and nobody lives there, so it was kind of pointless. It felt like they just skipped over half the story at that point because they needed to rush the game out the door. Like somehow we were supposed to care about this guy dying, even though he had next to no development throughout the game. So a complete remake would maybe allow Square Enix to go back to the drawing board a bit and really flesh out this world, story, and characters the way they clearly envisioned them to be. Instead of the game being a completely linear experience with no towns, maybe if they had the time to remake it, they would be able to create a more sprawling world, including towns this time around. And I mean, they sort of accomplished the goal of making a big sprawling fantasy world with towns in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, so maybe they can apply what they've learned there to Final Fantasy XIII. Wouldn't that be cool? But it begs the question, how would they be able to do this? Creative Studio 1 is currently working on the Final Fantasy VII Remake series, and then after that, they apparently want to do that Final Fantasy X-3 game that they say the script was already finished for, if that project ever gets greenlit. So are they going to work on Final Fantasy XIII Remake after that? Why would they choose to work on that instead of, like, any other Final Fantasy game, like 6 or 8? Clearly, those are more popular. Well, they might not have to wait until the 7 remake is done, and I think this might make sense when you take into consideration the idea of Fabula Nova Crystallis. Yeah, I'm talking about that cursed concept that fell apart and was abandoned over a decade ago. The Fabula Nova Crystallis project was supposed to include 3 games: Final Fantasy XIII, Final Fantasy Versus 13, and Final Fantasy Agito 13. And you all know the story. Final Fantasy XIII got turned into a trilogy, Final Fantasy Versus 13 was morphed into Final Fantasy 15, and Agito 13 was turned into Final Fantasy Type 0. And we all know that Nomura clearly still wants to make this Versus 13 a reality. Remember Verum Rex from Kingdom Hearts 3? Remember Yozora, who is clearly a reference to Noctis from Final Fantasy 15? But also, remember last year at a Kingdom Hearts concert, Nomura said that something happened that changed the direction of the Kingdom Hearts series. Well, hear me out. What if the thing that changed the direction of Kingdom Hearts was that Final Fantasy Versus 13 had finally been greenlit by the Square Enix executives? Now, I know that sounds crazy, but hang on. Now, remember that little game that came out in early 2023 called Forspoken, which was developed by Luminous Productions and completely flopped? Now, keep in mind the Kingdom Hearts concert was in March of 2023, and Square Enix announced just a couple of weeks prior to that the Luminous Productions was being shut down in late February, but that nobody was laid off. Just that they were to be merged with the rest of Square Enix. What if those people have been assembled into a new team responsible for not just bringing back Final Fantasy Versus 13, but actually reviving the Fabula Nova Crystallis project as a whole? Which, if that's true, then it would make sense that they would remake Final Fantasy XIII first, then move on to Versus 13, and then maybe handle Agito 13. And chances are many of the people there already have experience working on the games that were supposed to be related to the Fabula Nova Crystallis project, like Final Fantasy Type 0 and Final Fantasy XV. It would also make sense that the direction of Kingdom Hearts has changed, given that they were clearly supposed to use concepts from Versus 13 and Kingdom Hearts 4, but if they're actually going ahead and remaking Versus 13 the way it was intended to be, then there's no need to include them in Kingdom Hearts 4, hence the direction change. This also means that they don't need to intercept development of the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy to make these series of games possible. They can theoretically work on both the Remake trilogy and whatever comes after at the same time as they're working on reimagining the Fabula Nova Crystallis project games. So the question is this a good idea? Well, I personally have made fun of Final Fantasy XV on this channel in the past, and it's the only video game that I label a disaster piece. Now, I don't want to harp on the game too much in this video, as there will be plenty of time to do that in my Rediscover Final Fantasy series, where I intend to play every Final Fantasy game, including both 13 and 15, so you'll want to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss that content. But I don't hate the idea of the game. In fact, I would love nothing more than for them to remake it the way it should have been made in the first place. And in fact, I actually want to remake a Final Fantasy XV more than any other Final Fantasy game. I really think it has the potential to be one of my favorite games, but really felt that they missed the mark. A lot of Final Fantasy games, hell, a lot of video games in general, have to cut features and content here and there, and the game ends up being less than what the creators envisioned. But no video game I have ever played felt like it was missing as much as Final Fantasy XV. And no video game ever has disappointed me as much as Final Fantasy XV. So it might be a hot take, and maybe it's still too soon for a remake, but it likely wouldn't come out until next decade anyway, which at that point would make it a 10 to 20-year-old game by then. On the other hand, I'm convinced that the Fabula Nova Crystallis project is cursed, and they'll just find a way to fuck up the development all over again. So maybe it's not a good idea to bring it back?